Find other great podcasts like this one at podmoth.network.
Hey everyone, Dave here to tell you about my show Cryptic Cocktail Party. Looking for a good time filled with laughter, intriguing tales, and a splash of the supernatural? Well, maybe I can help. Every week I bring on a rotating cast of guests to have a few drinks, share a few laughs, and take a dive into the unknown. Join us as we raise our glasses and tell the tales of some of the world's most famous cryptids, from the legendary Grafton Monster to the elusive Dover Demon and the enigmatic Mothman. But that's not all. Our party spills over into the world of the extraterrestrial, encounter the spine-chilling Flatwoods Monster, the mischievous Hopkinsville Goblin, and uncover the truth about infamous alien encounters. You need a dash of mystery? We got you covered. Delve into mind-blowing conspiracy theories such as the infamous Philadelphia experiment and the secrets hidden within the Denver airport. Cryptic Cocktail Party is a weekly comedy podcast that guarantees laughter, curiosity, and a few surprises along the way. Cheers to the unknown.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Identity Podcast on the Podmoth Media Network, your foray into the weird, wonky, and sometimes downright spooky. My guest for the end of Season 9 is Nathan R. Stenberg. He is a first-generation disabled college graduate from Minnesota. Nathan works as an artist, actor, musician, film director, producer, consultant, certified personal trainer, public speaker, and scholar activist. He's interested in how the stories we tell about disabled people influence everything from depictions of disability in popular entertainment to policy decisions for the disability community in the United States. He's currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Theater Arts and Dance at the University of Minnesota. His dissertation examines how Pennhurst serves as a site to interrogate legal, medical, and societal perceptions of disability. His research reveals how popular performance casts disability as a specter that haunts quote-unquote normal, non-disabled society, thus perpetuating the idea that disabled people are less than human. Nathan is the co-chair of Events, Fundraising, and Outreach Committee and board member for the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance. So, Nathan, thanks so much for joining me. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about your work with Pennhurst and your position on the board of the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance?
Of course. So I got introduced to Pennhurst about 6 years ago when I was taking a class as a first semester grad student at the University of Minnesota's Law School on bioethics, biomedicine, and law. And it was really a fascinating environment to be with because I was a theater PhD in a room full of third-year law students who were about to graduate and go into hospitals working as counselors to advise doctors and hospital administrators on issues of medical ethics. And none of them realized that the room we were taking the class in was inaccessible to people with disabilities, let alone were they really interested in getting into any kind of historical debate around how the field of bioethics started and its historic exclusion of disabled people. So I went full tilt into researching institutions. And I had learned about institutions like the Willowbrook State School and Hospital outside of Staten Island that pretty infamously injected hepatitis into its underage inmates' chocolate milk, and eventually learned about Pennhurst through both the law side, the Supreme Court cases that closed Pennhurst, but then also because it was a haunted house. And I was really struck by this idea that a place such as an institution could be turned into a haunted house. So at the time, I was really interested in a totally other project, and I wanted to make it out to New Jersey to spend the summer with my then girlfriend, frankly. And I was like, well, I need to find a typical grad student. I need to find a way to pay my bills for the summer.
Right,
And
sure.
so I was applying to fellowships, and so I thought, well, there's this institution turned haunted house. I can sell this, I can get money for this. I'll research it for a summer and then, enjoy the time and then go on to the other project that I was interested in working in. And so sure enough, I I wrote the grant. I got the money as I anticipated, and then I reached out to the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance. It was just like, hi, grad student here coming out in the summer to do research. Like, anybody want to talk to me? And I got a response from the late Greg Pierman, who was at that time the vice president of the organization, who was like, oh, yes, of course, come talk to us. Like, you're interested in getting involved? And I was like, okay, hold on. Like, I'm just wanting to learn more. And long story short, I came out to Pennhurst in August of 2018, at the end of my first year in grad school. And the moment that I stepped on campus, I remember feeling my stomach drop in a way that it had not since I'd gone to Dachau.
Oh,
And
wow.
the big difference for me was knowing through the work that I had done on biomedicine and eugenics that I would not have been confined to Dachau. I would have been confined to the death camp, but I would have been confined to Pennhurst if I had lived in the area because of my diagnosis.
Sure.
And knowing that just filled me with such anxiety and dread. And then I met Dr. Jim Conroy, who is the president of the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, and we had a great conversation. And he was also the sociologist who did a longitudinal study about the quality of life of what happened to Pennhurst inmates when they were released. Did they get better? Did they get worse? And his research spanning over 20 years emphatically found that they did indeed find better quality of life and redevelop skills that they had lost since coming to the institution. So it was a very clear project showing that institutional environments not only produced harm, the antithesis of what they were sold as, but that actually being out in the community, being treated as human beings, what a novel idea, brought not only joy and a sense of value to their lives, but also finally fulfilled the mission that the institution could never perform. And anyway, all that to say, I had to ask the question because I was raised in a hospital. I've had numerous surgeries and spent most of my childhood living in the Shriners Hospital for Children in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And because I live with cerebral palsy, I know I would have been, likely a candidate for institutionalization. So at that time, I didn't really know much, but I had to ask Conroy the obvious question, and that was, would I have been there? And Conroy sized me up based off of his research methodologies and assigned me certain kind of categories and ability levels and functioning levels, and came to find out that, yeah, indeed, there would have been 20 some odd kids just like me at my current level of life. Mind you, I'm now ambulatory. I mean, I spent most of my childhood in carts, wheelchairs, crutches, etc. And so my fate would have been far worse, and the number of folks like me would have been far more numerous than it was now. So in that moment, it was just like, well, if I don't do this, this could be my life. This could be the life of someone else. And so it went from this pet project of just trying to, how do I put food on the table for a summer, to this is something that is much more potent.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the mention of Dachau and comparing that to Pennhurst, that really gave me chills. I watched the 1999 documentary Pennhurst.
Mm-hmm.
I've been through it several times now. I keep coming back to it just because it is so powerful, the way that it was produced. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Yep, yep.
Yeah. So the way that they incorporate sound into these absent places, that documentary, there was a lady on there that said that she did have cerebral palsy and was placed in Pennhurst. So yeah, I mean the fact that you say, you probably would have ended up there yourself. The fact that some of these institutions, like Pennhurst, are still active, like we haven't really come that far in terms of, care, for the mentally disabled, and it's really just, very sad. And you talked in your bio about people as people, and seeing people as their abilities versus, their disabilities. Like, for example, I mean, I'm hard of hearing, but that doesn't mean that I can't, have a conversation, or, enjoy, a cup of coffee and go for a walk outside and talk to somebody and be a human being, be a person. So yeah, it's just really, it's a powerful thing to think that, these places existed, and also that, in some sense they still do exist. And then you mentioned Willowbrook as well. Uh, I was introduced to Willowbrook through there's a filmmaker named Joshua Zeman,
Mm-hmm.
um, and he did a documentary called Cropsy. And Willowbrook was kind of, I mean, it was part of the story, but it was secondary, because they were talking about, a true crime story that kind of interlocked with that particular topic. But they had the segment there of the Geraldo Rivera expose,
Mm.
um, very much, line for line similar to the Baldini, the Bill Baldini, went in to Pennhurst,
Yep.
and revealed all this stuff and brought this stuff to the surface. The fact is, we just have to do better. you know, I don't know what
Yeah,
that
yeah.
looks like. As you mentioned, you take people out of these environments and you put them into, allow them to be people, go out into the world and have a job, have a family, have interactions with their own family. Regular social interaction is so powerful for people, and not just people who are disabled. I mean, people in general. We're social animals, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, two thoughts. The first is, I mean, just to be clear for your listeners, 36 states in the United States today segregate disabled people in institutions.
Yeah.
That it's still ongoing.
Yeah.
Just last week, there was an article in the New York Times arguing for the return of institutionalization. This is a continued theme on both sides of the political aisle and also within the disability community. Now, if you start to look at who is making those claims, particularly when it's coming from the disability community, it tends not actually, almost, I at least have never heard a disabled person asking for institutionalization to return.
Right.
It's always non-disabled advocates, parental parents, siblings who make the claim that their child or sibling needs these kinds of accommodations or custodial care. My question is how would you like it? The most, I think, apt metaphor we have for this, or analogy for this, is something we've all recently experienced but have seemingly oft forgotten, and that was isolation of COVID. That whole year of unknowing,
Yeah.
right? And sheer sense of anxiety and uncertainty, of lack of socialization, of being stuck, on places of residence, being sequestered, albeit with the comfort of things like Netflix and Tiger King, right? And your podcast, of course.
Right. Oh, sure.
But that is the daily existence for people existing in these institutions.
Yeah.
And so if you felt COVID isolation was hard, try a night in the institution, right? It's unbelievable to me that people in any way or form conceivably think that this is a rational, let alone humane choice to make. Particularly when you get down to the brass tacks of, like, how much these places cost states in terms of taxpayer money, federal dollars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just comes down to the reality of we have certain people in our society that we don't want to deal with. And those are primarily disabled people and old people. And to a certain extent, our children, right? We enjoy children, but then we're often very quick to, put them in boarding schools and other things to kind of rid ourselves of responsibility. And I think really, to your point you were making, is that this is about forcing society to take an honest look at itself and say who's here, who's not, and why.
Yeah, and I mean, on a completely unrelated topic, the medication of children also, to put them in boxes, because if you're overactive, you're probably just a curious, excited kid. But that's inappropriate, right? That's not what we want in our society. We want people to be cool, calm, and collected, and quote unquote normal. And this concept of normalcy, and everything has to be painted a certain way, and everything has to look a certain way. Yeah, I mean, I watched that documentary, and there's one gentleman, I forget what his name was, but he had cerebral palsy. And he said that from the time he got to Pennhurst until the time that he left, he was in a crib. He was just kept in a crib and was not let out for like any sort of like physical therapy or nothing, activities, nothing. He was just kept in this crib. And I think that they said something like the average Pennhurst resident got 3 minutes of psychotherapy a year. It boggles the mind. You're there, you're trying to help people who are mentally disabled, and at the same time you're only giving them 3 minutes of help a year. That just doesn't, it really just screams, we're here to see how much money we can make off the backs of these poor people who are suffering.
Yeah. So two thoughts, one a historical and one a contemporary. The first is, historically, unfortunately, with Pennhurst, and I say this as a someone who is a critical theorist who works in philosophy and performance, not so much in like practical traditional modes of, like Shakespeare, for example. I'm very much interested in kind of the theoretical ways that bodies transfer knowledge to one another. So I'm not a historian by training. And so I say that as a caveat to say, I have learned through this project the importance of really understanding the evolutions of care historically at places like Pennhurst. Because for better or worse, there were at times in this country where institutions did fulfill its mission of educating and socializing, quote unquote, I won't get into that, disabled people. And we're halfway decent, kind of similar to boarding schools. But that changed over time into the warehousing and terrible conditions that we are all so familiar with. But even within those periods of warehousing that we find within the 20th century, like take for example Pennhurst. I went from having to examine Pennhurst from like every 20 years to every decade, then down to every 5 years, to now where I can just about make every 3 years is typically where you start to see the shift. And so to understand the nuances of this place, you really got to get granular because it changes so much. But the crib case, as they were called, is not all that uncommon. And the level of care that you're describing is also not all that uncommon. And frankly, I would have been, when I was born, if I did not have certain medical interventions, I was labeled hyperactive and retarded. And I would have been a crib case. And thankfully I wasn't, because that would have been a death sentence. But so that's the historical standpoint of just saying that, like, looking at the history of Pennhurst, often it is about a lack of care. And the people who did care got swallowed by the bureaucratic system that institutions worked within. On a more present and contemporary lens, to give your listeners just a sense of grounding and how this continues to happen, if you look at Title 19 of Medicaid, when Medicare, and the way in which Social Security funds providers for people with disabilities, such as personal care assistants and group homes and things, oftentimes disabled people, such as my father, for example, who also lived with cerebral palsy, was forced to work at sheltered workshop, making under minimum wage. So in the case of my father, he was a mechanic who had to forcibly retire due to his disability. He was working for 30 cents an hour doing recycling, right?
Oh, wow.
While CEOs of these provider companies make millions of dollars a year. And once again, this just goes to show, like, where are our priorities, right? And this is not just, while most institutions have closed, the practices, the mindset, the philosophies that have allowed these kinds of violent practices to fester live on. And we see that time and time and time again. It's really just heinous that we continue to not bring awareness to this. And again, it's a question of, where's people's priorities, right? Because if Amazon doesn't deliver my stuff in 2 days, suddenly I'm without woe. But like, we can continue to relegate people with disabilities into subhuman places of employment, of forced community, and other things, simply because we are supposed, leeches on society. Where did that rhetoric come from? How does that become a process? And looking at places like Pennhurst allows us to understand that, and understand the historical evolutions of just how these things came to be.
Yeah, and speaking of evolution, I mean, the story of Pennhurst, as it began, I'm sure, as is the case with every new asylum, they had good intentions. They had a maximum head count. They were going to provide all of this quality care to people. So can we talk a little about the shift between it being this kind of idealistic healing space to what Pennhurst eventually became? And I know that that's like a huge question to ask, but if you can.
Read my dissertation. No, well, if you want to, that's probably the easiest way to do it. But
Sure.
for those of you who don't want to plow through academic writing, basically, I think about it. I was working for United States Senator Kristen Gillibrand out of New York a couple of summers ago, doing some specific work on disability policy aimed at personal care assistance for people with disabilities. And through my work on the Hill, one thing I came to realize was the significant issue surrounding Social Security, and specifically the monthly income that disabled people receive from social supplemental security income, and also SSDI, which is insurance programming, both of which my father received. And what this does is it creates an asset limit of $10,000. So a disabled person cannot have more assets than $10,000. And they cannot make a monthly income that exceeds $2,000. Let's think about this for a second. I live in Washington, D.C., in a basement apartment that I can barely, scrape by with. And my rent is $2,000 a month. So I can't pay the bill if I'm on Social Security disability income. Now, getting back to your point about how Pennhurst devolved, right? Using the example of Social Security, when that legislation that passed that put in place this asset limit and this monthly income restriction was during the Nixon administration. in the 70s. So $2,000 a month at that time was a lot of money. $10,000 in assets was pretty sizable. But now in 2022, it's nothing. It literally entraps disabled people into poverty. Hence why when my disabled father had to stop working and needed health insurance, he no longer had private insurance through his employer, he turned to Social Security and then had to forfeit all of his assets, retirements that he earned, et cetera, and then had to work in this sheltered workshop, right? So if you look at that, the reason why this has not been fixed is not because there's some obscene, nefarious puppet master who's pulling the strings in Washington, keeping disabled people oppressed. It's that we've moved on, right? There's all these different fires that we're trying to put out. And so we created this legislation, we patted ourselves on the back, and we said, it's okay, we're good now, we can move on. But it no longer reflects what disabled people need. And the same thing is true of institutionalization and the question that you asked about the devolution of the institution. So Pennhurst specifically was created in the time where eugenics, this idea that we could, create a human race that was perfected, think Nazi Germany. By the way, in Mein Kampf, Hitler cites institutions in America as what he would like to use as his blueprint for the Third Reich and what becomes concentration camps. And so that framework is in mind when Pennhurst specifically is created. But the legislation is it's actually pretty vague when you read it, but the intention is relatively clear that it was supposed to be a place for education, at least some kind of education. But ultimately, like the Social Security legislation, we pass the bill, we put money into it, and then when the rubber hits the road, the mechanisms that we created that we thought were good enough to do something slowly become more and more unapplicable to what is going on the ground, right? And so in that, the people in power, typically administrators, tend to, want to really, ask for more funding, but then they're getting denied. So it's a really complicated issue of not getting enough funding from the state not enacting new legislature to create new things, education of the people in charge, right? How are the people who are running these places viewing people like me, right? The people that they're supposed to serve. If they're being told in their coursework that I'm inhuman and I don't feel pain, they're going to see me as such. And then when they go to train the lower folks, the aides who are working with people like me on a daily basis, that dehumanization is going to get perpetuated, right? So it's just this kind of slow snowball effect that negligence, apathy, and sheer incompetence just starts to perpetuate, along with other more nefarious things such as eugenics and larger social movements, et cetera, et cetera. But again, keeping the analogy to the Social Security legislation in mind, oftentimes it's really just that we do something and it's really, really good, and then we say, yay, we got this done, and then we forget about it and we think that it's over with, right? In reality, oftentimes the needs of the disability community is more dynamic and more fluid than kind of large swath policy or bureaucratic organizations such as welfare mechanisms can really accommodate. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think that whole explanation of the system was excellent. I feel like it's so profound as a question, like what should we do? How can we fix this? It barely scratches the surface, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, I literally, as I'm about to speak, I mean, it just fills me with so much anxiety and dread, right, as a disabled person, because like one of the things that I write about in my research is how I have this thing. It's literally a theory of mine that I call the specter of institutionalization, and that is that for disabled people today, it is both in how society, law, medicine, education requires people who identify with some kind of non-normative body-mind experience to perform disability, to receive benefits, right? Or supports or legal protections. But it's also this existential fear that we all know that at any time, if someone in power just flips a switch and says, you know what, we really don't want to care for disabled people in the ways that we have been, and institutionalization is a better mechanism for that, we're going right back because we still do it. And to your point about, what are some kind of practical things that we can do here, one of the things I find most vitally important in my life is, particularly as a first generation disabled college grad, like making sure that every moment of my life I'm lowering the ladder for other disabled people to come along, right? In the grand scheme of things, I really don't have that much power. I have a relative amount of privilege that I've moved into later in life, and I want to recognize that and the power that I've managed to amass. But with what, power and privilege I do have and continue to accumulate, I want to make sure that, I'm able to lower that ladder for the generations of disabled people to come, because that's the only way we're going to find practical change. And I saw that when I was working on the Hill, because oftentimes I was the only person that came from a rural area in a non-coastal state who identified as disabled, right? Don't exist. And if we're not in the room, how are we going to make, choices and change that really reflects the needs of our community? Because ultimately, you meet one disabled person, you met one disabled person, right? So like, we need a whole bunch of folks because we all share just such unique experiences. And I think that's another thing about, the history of institutionalization is we tend to rabbit hole, these institutions as folks for just people who are mentally disabled, right? Or psychiatrically disabled folks go to asylums, or individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities go to institutions. But in reality, it was basically anybody who was deemed socially inadequate. That means a whole hell of a lot of people. And you'd be surprised who was there, because it's a lot of people for really pretty minor things. And if we lose sight of that, I'm afraid we're going to lose sight of this history and why it matters and why we should never go back.
As far as institutionalization is concerned, I mean, we're also coming from a place where, women could be institutionalized by their husbands because they were reading. Like we've come from, the lobotomy mobile, and all of these just insane treatments, that we thought were going to fix, quote unquote, fix people, and and kind of, here we are now, but it's not really any better than it has been,
Yeah. It's hard because, I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want to shortchange the amazing work of folks like Dr. Conroy and, frankly, a lot of the board members of the PMPA. If you look at their resumes, all of them are just giants in the field of deinstitutionalization.
Yeah.
And we've done a significant amount. And particularly when you look around the globe, I mean, right now, just looking at Ukraine and the way in which, for example, Russian soldiers are literally using disabled people as body shields, and the heinous environments that exist in other countries. I mean, we've gone a long way, and we don't want to lose sight of that. But I think what becomes problematic, right, is the disability community is having a reckoning in a lot of ways, as like communities of color are, right, around land grabbing, the forceful removal of indigenous peoples from their lands into reservations, and also the displacements of slaves and terrible racism of people of color, right? In that, like, slave plantations are technically no longer, and we're not, mostly not revoking indigenous folks from their lands. The afterlife of those things still exist, right? And it
Mm.
becomes almost more nefarious because it's less obvious.
Yeah.
And that's the same with institutionalization and the treatment of disabled people in this country. Like, yeah,
Sure.
we've closed most, not all, but most institutions, but it's also making the ways in which, systematic oppression of disabled people occurs more harmful and less obvious.
Yeah, and I mean that's really where it gets scary. When you start to not notice it, or you notice it, but it resembles something of what you believe to be the status quo. Or it's just understood that that's the way that that is supposed to function.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's where it gets really scary.
Yeah, just one example of this. Sorry, get me on my soapbox, I swear. But you know, and the thing is like I know you brought me on to talk about Pennhurst, but it's like there's just so many recent things to draw from of just like literally how screwed up all of this is.
Oh
So, for
yeah.
example, in 2021, a federal judge outside Boston, Massachusetts District Court, ruled that shock treatment, which is different from our medical professional listeners or your podcast from EVT or electroconvulsive therapy, which is commonly and rather controversially used in the treatment of people with psychiatric disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Shock treatment at this Judge Rottenberg Center in Canton, Massachusetts, was putting shock devices on the legs and bodies of children, inmates. And in the case of or the instance of the inmate that brought the case to the court, shocked 20 some odd times until he became catatonic.
Hmm.
And the federal judge ruled that this is acceptable, right? If you look at the literature in our education and like institutional training programming journals, the mechanical and chemical restraint of disabled people is still something that is deemed worthwhile and productive. And that's terrifying.
I honestly, I've had friends who have gone in for treatment, who have checked themselves in, for their own mental well-being.
Yeah.
And one of my friends actually did receive electroshock therapy.
Mm.
And I couldn't, it was like I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Like, you got what? Like, what happened to you?
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Right.
I just don't understand, because, you think about, like, those black and white grainy images of people, like, being held down on tables, with the leather thing in their mouth and the metal things on their temples. And you're like, oh, that's completely barbaric. There's no way that they're still doing that. And to some degree they are.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Totally.
yeah. And it's
Um,
just like, like, what do you think this is going to fix? Like, clearly it's not working.
well, and I
They've
would
done it
say
so many
too.
times before.
Right. Right. Well, and within disability, right? Like we have various models of disability, right? And depending on who you ask, they have different interpretations of this. But kind of like 3 or 4 main models are the medical model, the social model, the rights model, and a fourth model, just to highlight the work of a friend of mine and my friend Dr. Katrina Gierek, who is an amazing disability historian and activist. We've been working on this model, the value model of disability, that disabled people have inherent value, right? And but you're saying, your point about like how does this fix people, right? Like inherently, we have not moved away from the medical model of disability. That as a person with a disability, that disability is a biological material fact about who we are that is
Right.
inherently problematic and needs to be fixed, right? And I think we need to get away with that because oftentimes that leads to more issues than not. Now, on the flip side, don't get me wrong, if you talk to any disabled person, they will comment on, depending on the disability, right, the ways in which their disablement may impact their day-to-day life in real material ways.
Mm.
Pain, like you said, hard of hearing, right? And ways that there are certainly medical interventions to assist in that. But
Sure.
that shouldn't be the end, right? That you are a problem because you live with this thing, right? And I think that's the other large issue that we've not come to terms with, both in dominant non-disabled society, but also largely in the disability community, in that who do we want to be, right? Who do we find as human and who's not human? And I think once again, we just need to, we just keep kicking this down the can down the line. And I think about, like, the University of Minnesota awarded me the Diversity of Equity and Inclusion Fellowship, which I was blown away by. Because if you look at most of the diversity, equity, inclusion conversations we're having today, they're typically always about race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, but they're not about disability.
Yeah.
And disability intersects all forms of identity and identity groups, and yet it's the least talked about. And there, I think there's just a really fundamental question that we've yet to ask, and that is why, right? What is it about disability that makes non-disabled people feel that disability is something less than human? And until we really wrestle with that, I don't think we're going to see much change.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, actually. I mean, you see these issues kind of, resurface from time to time on a ballot, or whatever. Do you support Roe v. Wade? Do you want LGBTQIA plus people to be able to get married? And there's never, I mean, I can think back to, a few presidencies now where I don't think that's ever come up, on a ballot measure. What is it? So, what do you think of the current treatment of disabled people? Do you think that they should be treated better or as equals or have these certain rights? And, it never comes up.
Yeah. Well, and largely, I mean, putting my policy cap back on, like, one, I would say it's largely because we've not created disability as a platform, right? It's not an issue for people because we really only care about disability at the beginning of life and the end of life. And those are the times in which we are the most vulnerable and are least empowered or able to have our perspectives be recognized, right? And I think two other thoughts on top of that. A perfect example of this was anybody that followed the campaign of Senator-elect John Fetterman and the change of media coverage post his stroke. Right, there was a TV interview he did shortly before the election, and the interviewer just tore him apart for having used transcription software, and was literally like, "Oh, I don't know if he's mentally competent anymore to be taking office in the Senate of the United States." And it's just like, what? It's an access measure. There's nothing about competency here. Like, that's like saying that if a person can't get into a building because there's no ramp, that suddenly they're incompetent of doing their job.
Right.
Total bullcrap, and we know that, right? But suddenly, disability became an issue. And I would say, unfortunately, the Fetterman campaign didn't do a very good job of making disability a platform. If I was John Fetterman, I would have spun the crap out of that. I would have said, look, I identify with an experience that 26% of Americans live with.
Yeah.
Right? That's over a quarter of this country. While I'm coming to this experience later in life, I now know in a very minuscule way the intimate and difficult ways in which disability impacts the lives of Americans on a day-to-day basis. And I'm here to tell you that I'm going to fight for you. Right? I'm going to be the person who will champion your perspective because no one else has. Now that if I was his campaign manager, would have been the tack we would have taken. But of course, that's not the tack that they took. The tack was, I just had a stroke. I'm fine. Right? Like, it's just such non-disabled illusion of disability once again. Right? And on the flip side, when disabled people are asked to go and talk to their elected officials, you know, when you go to like a policy seminar or, you know, kind of have a workshop on how to talk disability to politicians, it's always, well, really what they're looking for is your stories. So if you just share all your traumas, maybe, just maybe, they'll listen to you and then feel enough emotion that they'll do something about this issue. Right?
Yeah.
And what that's doing is putting the burden of disabled people to employ emotional labor and share their traumas in the hopes, not even with a guarantee, but in the hopes that someone will care enough to maybe make a choice about this, right?
Yeah.
And so once again, it just goes to show that it's not about actually bringing disabled people in to say, what can we do or how can we make this different? It's simply about using disability as a vehicle that mostly non-disabled people can pass in and out of to either bolster their arguments or say that they've been disenfranchised. And it leaves disabled people and the experiences of disability out of the conversation, which I think is, you know, one of the real problematic and complicated parts of Pennhurst. Getting back finally to why you asked me to talk on this show, is that like with the haunted house, right? Because in many ways it brings the awareness of disability and institutionalization to the masses, right? Pennhurst was voted the #1 scariest haunt in America. It was referenced on, you know, Netflix's Stranger Things. Like, there's growing awareness of the attraction. And I will say one of the cool things is through my research, I've learned that most of the people that work there identify with living with some form of disability, and some have been institutionalized themselves. Granted, I know of no Pennhurst survivors who work there, but several of the haunters that I've gotten to know have family members who were institutionalized at Pennhurst and who died at Pennhurst.
Oh, wow.
Right? And what I think is so beautiful and also so complex about that is, on one hand, it explains how and why we as a society continue to sanction violence against disabled people, right? Because people will spend money to watch it for entertainment. Half the stuff that they're replicating in the attraction is the same kind of thematic violence that happens in real institutions. And it's about non-disabled people being entering into a space where they can observe that and partake in that in this very voyeuristic way for even just a moment, right? But be able to be safe while doing so and not have their sense of control over non-disabled people or their perceptions of, their sense of control over disabled people and their perception of disability really skewed in any way. But on the flip side, what's really powerful is that for the disabled haunters that work there, they feel like they can, you know, reclaim this space and reclaim their sense of identity and not just have to share their stories, right? They can literally scare the crap out of people and get a sense of like, yeah, I'm doing something here. And that's really powerful. But it's all under, again, the specter of institutionalization, knowing that at any moment we're all living in this state of precarity, that we could just end up in a place like Pennhurst, not performing either.
You're right. Yeah, and you know, Nathan, you keep saying, you know, well, let's bring it back to Pennhurst, you know, because that's the reason why you're here, and that's the reason why we're talking. I have done an episode on Pennhurst, and it was only about, you know, my usual podcast format is only about like 30 minutes, and really, what can you get through in 30 minutes, you know? And you don't get the whole story, you know, you get a little bit of the history and you get kind of sort of where it is now, and then that's about it. So one of the main reasons why I wanted to have you on was to kind of discuss the power that this institution held over people, because I think it says a lot about that kind of ghostly presence that it still has. Like I know a lot of those buildings, some of them have been demolished, and they're kind of making way for new things, and there's a museum, and they're doing the haunt and everything else. But as you said, I mean, yeah, there are people there who are scaring the crap out of other people, but there's this whole underlying kind of vibration of the fear that people who were sequestered to this place must have felt.
Yeah.
And I think it's profoundly important that information is also put forward along with hey, look at this really creepy spooky place, ooh, whatever, because I mean there are people involved. This is a place where people lived and died, and um I think it's important that we understand from all perspectives. So yeah, I mean, part of the reason was I wanted to have you on because I wanted to talk about the
Yeah.
haunted stuff, and we'll get to that. But I really, I want the baseline. I want to know what it was like. Like, for example, what was an average day, say, for a patient? Like, I know that the first patient was admitted in November of 1908.
Right.
So I mean, they start with good intentions. They're going to do all of these good things for people. So, what was that average day like? What were, meals, treatments, what were their living spaces like? And then, maybe like what was the average time that somebody might spend there, or like the reasons for commitment?
Yeah, and so that's a great and actually very complicated question to answer. And like it really just kind of depends on the time
Mm,
period, right?
mm-hmm,
Because that question evolves and devolves and evolves again over the course of time.
right.
In the early years, and I mean like for a very short period of time before the institution really started to get overcrowding, which took like, excuse me, like less than like 2 years just just to name that. Didn't take very
Huh.
long at all. Most of the folks that were admitted were non-custodial cases. Um, so, well, in the sense that like they wouldn't have been in cribs. They likely would have been ambulatory,
Mm,
and able to perform vocational labor. And in many ways, that is a holdover from the earlier days of institutions. So
mm,
institution philosophy back in the late 18th century, which shout out to Dr. Girick again, this is what he researches.
mm,
Institutional philosophy was really about you'd live there, but you'd also like learn how to farm if you were a person who identified as male, if you were more femme identifying, and granted these were very hard, gender roles, right? So it was man and woman at that
sure.
time, or boy and girl. And so then, for the girls, they would be doing more domestic based tasks, sewing, housekeeping, cleaning,
Mm,
laundry, etc. Um, and then, but the idea is that eventually, through that vocational training and then rudimentary educational classes, like basic writing and math, that they would be released back into the society to go back to their family farms to work. But, that
mm,
slowly eroded. So like even by the time that Pennhurst was created in 1908, right, because society is industrializing and these families are moving from the farm into the city. And
right.
so in the earlier days, so like let's just say the first maybe 5 years at most, you had, like I said, mostly ambulatory, non-custodial cases, folks who were essentially working, at the institution doing those kinds of vo-tech things, receiving those kinds of rudimentary classes. Then, by like 1915, the institution is already starting to get overwhelmed. And that's largely because, as I mentioned before, it wasn't just people with mental disabilities that were being institutionalized there.
Right.
I mean, I've seen a lot of immigrants, kids of immigrants who died. Heck, I've seen kids who just drooled too much that were
Mm,
institutionalized. One young man was institutionalized, I think, at 16 because he was chasing a girl around.
mm,
And he was on his way back from school, and like the superintendent just rounded him up and put him in the institution, right? And then, interestingly, in that case, when he was 21, when the law changed and required a court commitment, he was brought to a court to recommit him. And the panel of 3 judges were literally like, should this person even be in an institution? Like, what about habeas corpus? And they were like, well, it seems kind of sketchy, but the law is the law. So if you think he's still supposed to be here, then we'll keep him in. And that's what it was. And, but then you also started to get more custodial cases. So, and forgive me for any historians who are listening to this, I'm being very, very fast and loose with the facts and the dates and the details here, just so we're clear on that. But largely, if you were deemed a custodial case, you were someone who was non-ambulatory, who would have lived like on the first ward in a crib or a wheelchair, and you would have just been confined to existing. And these spaces didn't really have much. They were just drab, open space warehouses, essentially. And then the ambulatory folks, or folks who were deemed, higher grades. So the custodial cases were often called low grades. And this was, of course, based off of IQ testing and other things. But the reason that I don't use those kinds of markers is because the tests were often very, very inaccurate, right? Because think about it. If you've got someone who is a quote unquote custodial or crib case, who is nonverbal, who is blind, and perhaps lives with cerebral palsy, right? Has some kind of issue with like muscular spasticity. Most of the IQ tests of that time are completely inaccessible. So they're going to fail the test. It's like trying to take a ACT in English if you speak Spanish, right? You're not going to know what's going on. It doesn't mean you can't do well on a test. It's not accessible to you. And so a lot of the more medical diagnoses that I read in these patient files, I can't take with any grain of validity, and which is why I refuse to use them, frankly, like right now, even though they very much had them and that was part of it, right? So it was how superintendents and administrators and doctors view the children. So you've got the low grade folks who are kind of consigned to just existing on the first floors of wards, and then folks who are deemed higher grades, they were spent to do slave labor around the institution. You asked about the day. Didn't really matter, what your classification was. The day was roughly the same, waking around like 6, 7 o'clock. And then if you were high grade, you would go off into the fields or into the, warehouse or the factory or the kitchen or the laundry or wherever, depending on where you were, what job you were working, and you would work that with not much of a lunch break in between. And then you would go back and work. Or in the afternoon, sometimes you would go to school if you were deemed educable. And, this would often repeat. Now, granted, there was a lot of flux in this very wide generalization throughout the years. Some years emphasized more education, while others were just work emphasized. But then, as we kind of careen towards the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, that's when overcrowding became at its height. And so they were literally putting cribs on end to end, and the higher grade inmates were primarily just providing care for lower grade inmates because they didn't have staff like nurses and things to cover them. And they were also subject to a lot of research testing. So, like for example, at Pennhurst, there was a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania's medical school, who also was one of the first administrators at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who conducted experiments on children using influenza, syphilis, other things, kind of like the hepatitis thing at Willowbrook. And, these kids were basically, because the parents transferred consent over their children to the state, they were wards of the state and could be deemed, worthy of such research. But then as like the 70s came along, and labor that was being performed by the inmates suddenly had to go back to the non-disabled administrators, and they didn't have enough staff, right? So then the care and the kind of quality of life took a nosedive, in the sense of like there was just nothing for them to do, so they just sat there. a lot of the time.
Yeah, and then it's around this time, right, that the Bill Baldini expose, I think, was 68
Yep, yep,
for
yep.
NBC 10. Yeah, he comes out with Suffer the Little Children.
Yeah, and that was, and I think exposés, particularly as someone who studies performance, I think is really kind of an interesting thing because, they're incredibly necessary, but they also very much kind of reify these understandings of like, non-disabled people who are kind of closer to the non-disabled expectation
Hmm.
get, like there's this moment where Baldini interviews little Johnny, and Johnny gets put in the Quaker, which was a quote unquote low grade ward where Johnny lost functioning in a lot of ways, right?
Hmm.
And the whole crux of the scene was about how, oh, Johnny should have been, normal. Like he never should have been here, and now he's in Quaker and he's losing function, which is not wrong, right? But
Right.
it's also really interesting who's not in that film, and that's mostly the crib cases, the low grades,
Hmm.
right? And there again, it gets back to this question of how do we define who is human? Of us with disabilities that make us, pass as more non-disabled, such as myself in my current state, right? Like if you were to look at me, probably wouldn't know I was disabled or that I spent my life in a hospital or in a wheelchair
Hmm.
or crutches, leg braces, etc. And so people, I feel like that kind of makes disability more safe for folks. And what's interesting in those exposés is it's kind of a real tour de force of reifying non-disabled norms, despite
Hmm.
really good intentions of trying to make change in this place.
Sure. How did Pennhurst deal with the bad press that it was receiving? Or did they?
Yeah, yeah, and there's some really interesting questions. Like, for example, Greg Pierman, as mentioned before, he was around during that time period, and his kind of, perceptions of all that it's just rather interesting, right? Because in many ways, institutions and Pennhurst alike was, they're no stranger to controversy and to issues like this arising. But
Sure.
I think, there was there's a certain kind of like, well, what can we do, right?
Hmm.
And it's hard because frankly, the archival record of Pennhurst ends right around the early 1960s, so like 61, 62. So in the archive, there's not a lot of material from administrators or other things to get a sense of how they responded to it,
Oh, okay.
frankly. And there's probably a wide variety of why that exists, but it's kind of basically after the 1960s, Pennhurst becomes a black hole. And
Oh,
unless you interview someone who was working in the administration or know someone, I mean, the perspective changes, of course, and who you talk with.
sure.
But in my research, there hasn't been a lot of really clear documentation about how the institution um, dealt with it. But
Hmm.
my guess is from the patterns of other, controversies that they weathered, and also, obviously we know what happened to Pennhurst, but they likely tried their best to, make some changes as they could, but were likely also held up, through bureaucratic mechanisms like lack of funding from state legislatures,
Yeah.
apathy and negligence of actors at the institution, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it was around that time too that there were some staff members that were indicted for a bunch of different offenses, assaulting patients and um, forcing patients to fight one another and just kind of all this despicable stuff. Yeah, I wondered, just because, like you said, there's no, it turns into kind of a black hole. And what do? You get this bad press and you're like, well, okay. I mean, there's still going to be, two staff members to every 60 or 70 patients because we have
Yeah,
no more money to put into this. So what are we going to do? Um,
yeah, yeah. And
and
I
then in
think,
1981, Time magazine comes out with this article that says that, it's understaffed and it's dirty and it's violent. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, it didn't change from, you know,
right,
like,
right,
how were they going to change? They didn't have any money to change. They weren't given any other option than to just be what they were.
right. And I mean, so a couple of thoughts. One, I mean, I think it's interesting. One of the most fascinating reads I've ever had was reading through all the newspaper clippings of local and state newspaper articles written about Pennhurst. And, you see these kinds of issues that are raised in the Baldini film from basically day one of Pennhurst.
Yeah.
And there had been multiple investigations by the FBI, by the state police, by the governor's office, by the Department of Welfare, time in and time out, decades before Baldini. Hell, I think even probably before Baldini was born.
Sure.
But don't cite me on that. These abuses did occur quite frequently, and there were a number of investigations. And I think one of the things that also is kind of unfortunate that gets glanced over in this is, despite all of the terrible, and I am in no way attempting to glorify or idealize the institution, but Pennhurst also made a lot of really profound impact in the field of, at that time, mental retardation through grants it was receiving. And I mean, it was Band-Aid on an eviscerated wound.
Right.
I mean, it was don't get me wrong, but I mean, I think it is important to recognize that, for example, music therapy. There's a video on YouTube, Somebody Touched Me, which was narrated by Henry Fonda, which was a film that the federal government sponsored in response to a federal grant that Pennhurst had received. And the film is gross. I mean, frankly, as a performance scholar, it's a total reification of how non-disabled people view disabled people.
Sure.
But they were doing substantial stuff, particularly in music therapy and other areas. And it's really hard because I remember talking with Greg, the administrator turned PMPA co-founder that I was mentioning. He was adamant until the day that he died that they could turn the ship around, right?
Yeah.
Just given more funding and given more time, that they really could have made meaningful, impactful change at Pennhurst. And frankly, I disagree with him. Sorry, Greg, but I think that it's important to recognize that, though, and to hold that experience as at least valid for themselves.
Pennhurst officially closes in December of 1987. After that, does it sit dormant for a while, or do they go right to building demolition, or?
Yeah, oh my gosh, I wish I could just show you my giant, literally my timeline spans my entire wall, because I've had to just literally map this part out. If and when I ever want to write another book after I finish the first one, I want to write it on the 20-year period between 1987, when Pennhurst closed, and 2008, when it reopened, when it was purchased as the haunted house, because it's just so fascinating. Because it's this pertinent moment of what does the state do when you have this site of trauma? Do you preserve it? Do you sell it? Do you forget about it? A little bit of everything, and the little bit of everything is kind of what happened. They started parceling off some of the land before Pennhurst closed, because I think they kind of knew it was coming, frankly. So they gave the female colony, which was the northern part of the campus, which was separate from the lower or boys colony. This was a eugenics thing to keep disabled people from having children, of course, because God forbid we reproduce.
Right.
They sold the female colony to the Veterans Association, who tore down the buildings and literally built new buildings on top of the foundations of those old buildings that still exist today as a retirement home for the VA and a hospital, which is really kind of interesting to me in a myriad of ways. Then part of the farmland was parceled out into an armory for the VA, which is also where the cemetery is. And so I always tell this to our would-be urban explorers: do not try to go find the cemetery, because you will literally, and I'm not kidding here, get shot. It's on the firing ground. And then from there, once it closed in 87, the state goes back and forth. And I mean, it's almost every year there's a
Sure.
new bill introduced by a state lawmaker or a new company that introduced a desire to purchase some of the property, or the local government tries to do something. And so there's this oscillation about what to do with it. And ultimately, most of the property just kind of sits dormant. Um, Large swaths of the farmland was sold off pretty quickly. Interestingly, what used to be most of the farmland in Pennhurst is now a golf course, which I always think is interesting, right? Like, what do we do? And it's all about commodification and money in many ways, right? Like,
Yeah.
people are worried about their keeping under par. They're literally worried about their handicap while playing on the grounds of farmlands where disabled people died of
Right.
exhaustion and induced by slave labor. Anyway, how's that for your Sunday afternoon? 9.
Yeah.
But parts of it got consumed by local church, and then there was conversation in the town. There was like going to be a fishery. There's all these different ideas, but then nothing ever really materialized until in 2008, when then the state decided to move forward with LLC, Pennhurst Holdings, to purchase the property. And it came with a lot of really unease, like PMPA, Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, was started like literally the moment that the sale of the property had taken place, because they had been hoping to make a physical site of remembrance or documentation.
Sure.
And then lo and behold, when they found out that the owners were not going to move through with this plan to tear everything down and make a new development property, but God forbid make a new haunted house, things really started to get weird quickly. And that's when there was a whole lot of tussle between local constituents, the PMPA, state actors, et cetera, brought us into our current moment.
Yeah. So the ghost tours, what buildings do people go through, and what were those buildings formerly?
Yeah. So before I begin, I just want to make a quick shout out to the crew at Pennhurst, Autumn, Emily, Caden. Y'all continue to just kill it and do amazing work on those ghost tours. And part of my answer actually, it depends on the work that they do. So it started when I first came out in 2018. It was basically just the Mayflower, which is a former boys' dorm.
Okay.
Was M Ward is what it was called. It was just a letter for the longest time until I think like the 70s, when they gave them kind of like pseudo ridiculous names, very Pennsylvania names. And but then moved over to the subterranean tunnels that span the grounds, primarily the Rockwell Tunnel. Rockwell was the school building that eventually got demolished, I think, in 2019. And then, thanks to the work of Autumn and her ghost hunting crew, they have slowly opened more spaces on campus, because as the owners realized that the ghost hunts were quite profitable, they were more willing to put roofs on buildings, abate buildings, and then Autumn's crew went in and cleaned them out.
Sure.
And so then moved to D building, or Devon Hall, which is the largest building ward on campus. And this is all in the lower boys colony, about 60 acres of land. And then Autumn cleaned out the infirmary, which is actually where most of the inmates died at the institution. And that's been really, really popular by the paranormal investigators. And word is now that they are looking to expand into other buildings as time and literal infrastructure will allow. Because with the state leaving these buildings dormant for all the years, the roofs caved,
Sure.
nature started to reclaim the space. And once the roofs go, it's really quick downhill spiral.
Right.
But the buildings are pretty solid, actually. And so for the buildings that they can, they are trying to keep. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic, because one of the proudest things that I've ever been able to do in my life is to open the relationship between PMPA and the LLC. Because before I came on the board, they literally viscerally hated each other. And like, I mean, I can't even explain how angry they were at each other. And for, I think, really obvious and valid reasons.
Sure.
But my research, I was the first person to ever go through and actually talk to the people that worked there. Most other researchers had gone through the attraction or to a ghost hunt and just wrote off everyone as being non-disabled, right? And just being a bunch of jerks who were trying to commodify atrocity.
Right.
And my research was the first to really go in and like, hey, tell me about yourself, right? And through that, and through realizing how connected these people are to the space, that's when we started to get PMPA on board. And so what's really interesting about that then is like the work of Autumn and her ghost hunting crews, like they're actively preserving this place, right? But they're also doing so knowing that they have to make it sellable. They have to make it marketable, because the only way the LLC is going to keep this place up is if they continue to make money.
Yeah.
And so it's a real deal with the devil in a lot of ways, but they genuinely respect and care for this place as their own. I mean, they literally use like a geo tracker and refer to it as home, right? And so you can tell the ways in which, for the disabled people that work at Pennhurst, this has really come to define, and I'm going to say our lives, because it has come to redefine my life as well.
Yeah.
And I think, what's so palpable about this is if you talk to really any institutional survivor, they fall on 1 to 2 camps. They're either tear these places down or keep them up. Most of them, frankly, say tear them down. And most of the Pennhurst survivors I've talked to have all said tear it down. But for me, I think what's really important is that we don't. Because while I understand and want to validate the experiences and rationale of the survivors for why they want these places to go away, I fear that if we literally destroy them, we'll forget. Right? It's the same thing about Auschwitz and the institutions. We can never go back. We can never forget. And for better or for worse, this private LLC is doing something that the state never did or never expressed interest in doing. And that is preserving my community's history. But on the flip side, right, this also opens a really complicated question about Pennhurst is the only operating museum of disability history in the country. And it's owned and operated by a for-profit LLC whose primary business venture is haunted houses.
Yeah.
Right? So what does that tell about society and how they view people like me and our community's history? Right? If it wasn't for the work of Autumn and her team, and mind you, most of these folks are all under the age of 21. Autumn, for example, is a disabled first-generation college student who's finishing up her senior year, right? Who are not historians, who are not archivists, who are not geologists, right? They are just vernacular people, disabled people, who are doing this because they care and they don't want our community's history to go to the ash heap.
Yeah.
And are literally, actually, figuratively, and quite literally pulling our community's history from the ash heap. Because when you go into these buildings where they're grabbing these artifacts from, they're literally covered in ash and debris, right?
Yeah.
And so I think for all those who want to dismiss the haunted house or the ghost hunts or whatever, right, for being this like terrible thing, I'm really profoundly struck by the question of, well, what have you done for us lately, right? And if you look at what the people at the haunted house are doing, they're doing a whole hell of a lot. In fact, a lot more than most of us in our community are doing to preserve and to keep our history intact. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. You've already kind of answered this question. It was sent in by a listener, so I wanted to kind of present it to you formally anyway. Mike from Boston wanted to know why you feel it's important to maintain the history of the asylum. And I know that you were talking about, a lot of the former Pennhurst residents say to tear it down. A lot of people in the community say to tear it down. There are some people who are saying, keep it up. Um, and, I think it all comes back to, those who, I forget how the quote goes, but those who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, yeah.
And, I keep coming back to that quote over and over again whenever I, kind of do research on, one of these, asylums, particularly the ones that are just defunct and are not, they're just kind of rotting away. Um, the model, there's clearly a model, right, for these places.
Yeah.
And it seems like they follow the same framework every single time whenever they create one of these places. They say, we're going to create this amazing place that's going to have this and this and this and this, and it's going to help people so profoundly. And then it just devolves into this, for lack of a better word, cluster.
Yeah.
You have people sleeping on top of each other. All of a sudden you have people who are being moved from like the juvenile or the prison system into these places. You have staff that are overworked and underpaid, and then you have all of these abuse issues. And so I guess, why why do you feel it's important to maintain the history of the asylum? But
Mm.
also, how do you feel about the fact that this is like, it's almost like somebody has a stamp, and they're like, I'm going to put an asylum here and an asylum there, and it's, and they're all the same, and it's all the same story.
Yeah. Well, so a couple of thoughts on that. The first is I just want to again give credence to Autumn and the disabled haunters at Pennhurst, because
Mm,
I think alongside them. I mean, as an ethnographer, I'm really fortunate that I get to theorize and to not only theorize and think with these amazing people, but also get to know them and call them friends and
right.
family. And as one disabled haunter told me, there will be a time where the space that supports disabled people is run by disabled people.
Mm,
But until that point, we must work to create it. And I think that kind of sums it all up, right?
mm,
Because in terms of why we need to remember this history or why we need to keep Pennhurst around, is because Pennhurst, these stamps, these monoliths that you're referring to, are created by non-disabled people who intend them for disabled people. And despite this, despite the atrocities that happened there, despite the ways in which no human, disabled or not, should ever have to exist there, these spaces, by the way in which disabled people have lived there, have found joy, pain, suffering, humor, all the emotions one feels in this space,
mm,
it leaves an imprint, right? And it
yeah.
makes that space a disabled space. And what's so
Mm,
profound, I feel like, about the work that the disabled haunters are doing at Pennhurst is, yes, they're not Pennhurst survivors. And you're damn right, I wish we could have more survivors helping us in this work. Unfortunately, many of them are no longer alive, or provider agencies won't allow us access to them, or they just don't want to be a part of it. And that's their prerogative. I totally understand.
sure.
But what matters is that it's a community of disabled people who are coming together and forming a community under their terms, right? To come back to that quote, it's creating a space of their own, and not a space developed and designed by non-disabled people and made to retrofit for disabled people to exist in, like institutions.
Mm,
And that's where the power lies, right? And we need to keep doing that. So it's both so that we never forget, we never go back, but also so that we begin to think and live out a future that is both defined by and brought about by disabled people, for disabled people.
Yeah, that's very, very profound.
You
It
know,
makes me wonder how long that will take. Um, I mean, I hope it happens tomorrow. Um, I really do. Um, having had friends who have had to kind of go into these places and have had their own experiences there. Um, having had my experiences with mental health, I've always been very open and honest on this podcast about the fact that I suffer from anxiety, um, and that I'm managing it with medication, but it's one of those things. It doesn't always get fixed. It's something that you live with.
right.
So I've always been very open and honest about that, and I certainly hope that that this conversation opens more eyes to the issues that the disabled community faces on a daily basis, um, and maybe we'll start to see some change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ultimately that's the hope, right? And I think like that's why I'm so determined about going back to that mentorship model, right? And really lowering the ladder.
Yeah.
One of the most powerful things I've ever done in my time with the PMPA, going back to your very first question you asked, was after I got the PMPA and the Pennhurst LLC to talk, I created a fellowship program. And Autumn, who I've referenced before, was the first recipient of that fellowship program.
Mm.
And we're now in our second year. Both our fellows happen to identify as women, disabled women, first generation college students. Um, and I get to serve as a mentor. And that has left a profound mark on my life
Mm.
because I never had a mentor doing that. I mean, I remember I was giving a lecture. I was invited to give a talk at a prep school. This was about a month ago, and one of the students, the only black man in the class, raised his hand and asked me, "Did you have any role models growing up?"
Mm.
And his question literally almost brought me to tears. I had to like fight them back because
Yeah.
I knew what I had to answer, and that was no.
Yeah.
Society doesn't make role models out of disabled people. And so, to your point about, hopefully we'll see that change, right?
Mm.
To me, the answer, the guarantee of seeing that change results in that wherever we are in life, whatever position, power, privilege, or lack thereof that we occupy, that we ensure that we are open about our disabilities as we are safe and able to do so,
Sure.
and that we seek out other people with disabilities, especially younger people with disabilities, and let them into our lives, right? And to
Yeah.
provide, whether it's explicit or implicit, you're going to be doing mentorship whether you realize it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And through that, right, that's why this has been such a profound thing for me. Because yeah, I mean, I give them some, I get to give them a title and I get to give them some money, from the PMPA. But I think what matters the most through these conversations is that they know that they're human, that they have value, and that they are cared about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that they too can do something. And for me, it's been beyond rewarding to know that, you know, there's someone coming up behind me and that there's more chance for that change to happen because it is happening. And I think that is my only provocation to the listeners is just, seek out opportunities for those mentorship possibilities, particularly if you identify as disabled, but even if you don't, because
Yeah.
really no matter what the course of change is or the topic of change is, the course for that is just ensuring that we empower the people who come up behind us.
Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. This has been such an amazing conversation. I honestly did not think that I would learn as much about Pennhurst as I have in the last hour, but yeah, it's been really fantastic. So thank you so very, very much.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much for having me on here. A real pleasure.
Yeah.
Happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I instantly want you to email me your dissertation, obviously, because I want to read that and geek out over it. But is there anything you'd like to add? I always leave time for shameless self-promotion, so if there's anything.
Yeah, of course. I mean, multiple things. One, please check out the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance website, preservepennhurst.org. We're actively looking for donations, especially to benefit the Pennhurst Museum, which again is the only operating museum of disability history and culture right now in the country, and that's huge. Please don't let our history go to the ash heap of history, and let the work of Autumn and her other amazing staff go to waste in that way. Check out Pennhurst Asylum on Facebook. The shout out to the crew and their work as well. Ghost hunts, history tours. Their website is pennhurstasylum.com. And then finally, for me, a couple of different things going on. I'm always looking for anybody who wants to bring me on as a public speaker or a consultant. I do a lot of access consulting and a whole variety of things. You can check out my website. It's www.nathanrstenberg, STENBERG.com. And then finally, I'm really happy to announce I'm co-directing a film about Pennhurst, because I realized that probably outside of you, Janine, no one is going to want to read my dissertation. So I'm going to make a film about it. And we were just awarded Catapult Film Fund's development grant, which is super exciting. They're a real prestigious film fund who are known for taking risks on films that are trying to tell a story that has not been told. And they for example, they provided early funding to Crip Camp on Netflix, which is an amazing documentary about the disability rights movement. So it feels really exciting to be recognized in that way, and also just to be able to have the opportunity to tell the stories of the disabled haunters as well as the Pennhurst history in a cinematic way. And so look forward to that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will set you free.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you so much. You have a good night.
Yeah, you too, Janine.
That's it for this week, dear listeners. Tune in next time for more tales of the creepy, weird, and paranormal. Until then, stay spooky. The Identity Podcast is brought to you by host Janine Mercer. The podcast is written and edited by Janine Mercer unless otherwise stated, and the music is created using GarageBand. You can find the Odd Pod on Twitter and Instagram @IdentityPod, and a transcript of this episode can be found at theidentitypodcast.wordpress.com. Don't forget to share this podcast with your friends, leave a review, and subscribe so that you'll be in the know when a new episode drops.